Good morning. It's that time of year again when I'm compelled to come up here and at many places, the workplace, within a country, um, within work, and that sort of thing. When I first came to the church, I was working at a job that it was a union job, and so I was kind of limited by the scheduling, which was pretty even, but seniority amounted to controlling whether you ended up having to work on the weekends or not. So when I first started working there, weekend work was expected. I came to the church while I was working at this place, and I decided I was going to make a stand. The reason I came to this church was because of the Sabbath. It was the understanding that the Sabbath was Saturday and not on Sunday, and God convicted my heart to make a change and to stand up for that. And so I wrote a letter. I got a suggestion from a lawyer who was working within the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and through some of these organizations that advised me on the best way to approach the problem. And so I did. I followed his advice, and I wrote a letter to the management of the company, and to my delight, and put me to ease, they honored my request of not being forced to work on Saturdays. Now, I didn't get into the nitty-gritty of 5 o'clock or the sundown on Friday or anything, but the hours that we kept was going to take care of that on its own. But the biggest thing was that I wasn't going to be forced to work on Saturday. Now, did I say this was a union shop? Trust me, I didn't make any friends when I was having Saturdays off, and higher senior guys were having to work, and they would look at me and say, "Well, that's not right. That goes against the policy." But the company honored it, and so I was not put in a position of having to worry about it. And I know there's a lot of people who are in workplaces where they require Saturday work, and they don't have that accommodations. And so it creates a hardship for somebody who is convicted to honor the Sabbath. So with that being said, I'm going to read Seventh-day Adventists. It's just informational, saying religious liberty, freedom to believe. The Seventh-day Adventist Church strongly believes in religious freedom for all people. A person's conscience, not the government, should dictate his or her choice to worship or not. We have advocated for these goals for more than 100 years through our Department of Public Affairs and Religious Liberty to governments and religions and international organizations. This advocacy takes many forms: fighting against laws that would inhibit a person's religious freedoms, working to obtain the release of individuals imprisoned for religious reasons, and supporting the rights of individuals fired from their jobs for following their conscience, to name a few. As the official voice of the Adventist Church on matters of religious freedom and human rights, this organization maintains offices in Washington, D.C. to allow for convenient access to the U.S. Congress, New York City, to influence the United Nations, and at the church's world headquarters in Silver Springs, Maryland. They also sponsor international religious liberty associations on behalf of the Adventist Church. They are a non-sectarian organization in supporting religious freedom around the world. the first organization of its kind. It's ERLA is what it's called, brings together representatives of many faiths, including Catholics, Baptists, Muslims, Jews, Mormons, Buddhists, and others to support religious liberty. They promote this vital cooperation through conferences, religious liberty festivals, and other events, collectively raising awareness and educating government officials around the world. This priority is vital to the Seventh-day Adventist Church. While we are a rapidly growing denomination around the world, the church often finds itself in the religious minority and consequently understands the importance of ensuring that all voices be allowed to speak. If you heard what I just said, it's not just the Seventh-day Adventist Church that these organizations are looking out for all religions, and we need to support that idea that if the government's going to crack down on one religion, what's to keep them from cracking down on ours? And so religious liberty needs to be across the board for all religions and non-religions. Atheists need to have the same protections. So, with that being said, I'd like us to go to John 18, verse 38. John 18, verse 38. And Pilate said unto him, What is truth? And when he had said this, he went out again unto the Jews, and said unto them, I find in him no fault. That was John 18, verse 38. Okay. What's significant in this verse? We have two groups that are mentioned. Yeah, I'm kind of going to treat it like a Sabbath school class, I guess. I may ask a question, and feel free to answer me if you choose. Otherwise, I'll answer it. But there are two groups of people that are involved here, and this is obviously at Jesus' trial. There's two groups that are mentioned. They are the Jews, which is a religious group. They are Pilate, which is a government. So the thing that we understand about religious liberty is governments often control how much we have. Now, we're very fortunate in the United States that we have a constitution, right, that protects us from the government being too overbearing, and so they don't get in the way of our religious freedom. Is that correct? Yeah, we have the Constitution, but does the government interfere sometimes? They do, even in this country where we have the Constitution and the First Amendment, which protects us from governments. It still happens. Let's look at Matthew. Chapter 5, verse 11 and 12. Before we read this, we have to understand that, and we know, we've been taught, that when we're persecuted, is that a bad thing? It's not necessarily a bad thing. How does God teach us patience? How does God teach us anything? Often God teaches us, gets our attention, puts us in a situation that is not necessarily pleasant. I call that persecution. And persecution can come from governments. It can come from other churches, from within the church itself. So persecution comes from all different angles, and it affects us the same way. So with that being said, let's read Matthew 5, verse 11 and 12. Blessed are ye when men shall revile you and persecute you, and shall say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven. For so persecuted they the prophets which were before you. I guess this sermon can be looked at as kind of negative, and it's not. You may not leave, real happy about it. But the one thing that we have to keep in mind, and the reason why I put this up front, is because God tells us to be joyful when we're persecuted. He tells us to, when men revile you and persecute you falsely for my sake, rejoice and be exceedingly glad. So when we look at these sort of things and the things that have happened throughout humanity, we always must remember that in God's plan, and God, keep in mind, God has a government, and that we're supposed to always take a persecution as a learning experience, something, and also as a testimonial. Lloyd, you talk a lot about how we portray ourselves in front of our friends and neighbors and such, because we have a responsibility to react to things in the correct way. I'm not going to say positive or negative, but in a correct way, in a godly way. And we learn God's character, and we try to portray that same character among the people that we're around. I'm going to talk briefly about history. History is one of my favorite subjects. It's kind of funny because I failed American history the first time I went through it. I did pass the second time, possibly with a D, but over the years I've found the importance of history and have learned to really appreciate going back and Berkeley at things. When we're talking about religious liberty, first thing is what was it like throughout the last 2,000 years? We read a scripture with Jesus being on trial. Now, the interesting thing about that trial was the government had the power. A disclaimer here is they think they have the power. God has the power. But the government had the power to crucify or not. They could make the choice one way or the other. And Pilate says, I find no fault with him. And yet he still crucified him. Why? I'm sorry? Right. The people representing religion insisted on it. And there was a side note that they could release a prisoner at Passover time, and they chose somebody other than Jesus. So we all know what the story is, but the point of the matter is there was a government person who had a choice of releasing him or not. Throughout history, after Christ was crucified, and the years following Christ's crucifixion was a rather difficult time for Christians. And we all have heard about the persecutions against Christians. It was not just the Christians, it was the Jews as well. And if you look at the history from year to year, it was the Christians, and then it was the Jews, and Constantine legalized Christianity, and then it was the Jews, and all these things we really have to look at when we're talking about religious liberties. So this period of time, the first 1,000 years after Christ, was not just Christians and Jews. It was Christian persecution by Islam, by Islamists. And there was a lot of fighting and wars and persecutions from the Islam faith. So it's not just governments, but it's it's religions that have influence. So it's something important to remember, that our persecutions don't just come from governments. They come from, a lot of cases, they come from Christians, other Christians. Do you know any Christians that say that we're a cult, that we belong to a cult? Is that a form of persecution? They look at us in a different light, don't they, when they say that we belong to a cult. So, we're affected by how other people think of us, and yet we have to stay strong and stay focused. I had to continue to take my Sabbaths off, no matter how hard the fought back. I had to keep my Sabbath. During the Middle Ages, after 1000, it was mostly Muslim persecutions. The Crusades comes to mind. What was the Crusades? The Catholic Church. Now, when I talk to people, particularly, and I mention the church, who are they talking about? 9 times out of 10, they're talking about the Catholic Church. And I remember having a conversation with my son about Christianity, and he says, but the church did this, and talked about all the persecutions and all the killings and all the persecutions that occurred during the Crusades. And I couldn't explain to him that was mostly a Catholic-led function, but it didn't necessarily represent Christianity the way we talk about Christianity. Can't, they don't always listen to those kind of details. After the Crusades, which continued with Muslim persecutions, eventually began forced doctrines among other Christian groups. So it just isn't that cut and dried. You can't point to one group or one government or anything and say this is where the persecutions lie. After that, Christian bans in many countries, including Japan and others, have affected and caused persecutions against particularly Christians. Now keep in mind that all religious groups have their own stories of persecutions. We can look back to the Pilgrims and the Puritans during the 1600s, and their migration to America was because of persecution. The King of England demanded that their church be followed, and they said no, they didn't want any part of it. At the same time, the Christian influence was the same. They insisted on worshiping a certain way, and they said no, I don't want a part of it. So they chose to migrate to America for religious liberty, which is one of the reasons why we hold religious liberty in such high esteem here in this country. Modern times. Persecutions, modern times. There's an organization called Open Doors, and they estimate that 5,621 Christians were killed for their faith, and 14,766 churches, Christian properties were attacked. This is a six-fold increase in the number of attacks on the church compared to the previous year. This is 2023. This is recent. Displacement. In 2023, more than twice as many Christians were forced to flee their homes than in the previous year. Countries of concern. The United States Department of State labels certain countries as countries of particular concern for their government's tolerance or engagement in severe violations of religious freedom. Non-state types of persecutions. Many Christians are persecuted by non-state actors such as Islamic State and others. Africa, political instability, war, extremism have created a dangerous situation for Christians in Africa. In China, at least 10,000 churches were closed. So this is current. This is, what's happening right now in our world. Now, how about in our country? What counts as persecution? Any number of things. It can be being slandered or mocked for your faith, or being passed over for a promotion at your consulting firm because you refuse to fly the pride flag from your cup holder during June. It's anything and everything from suffering social ostracization to getting put on trains and taken to death camps. Christians would do well to recover a robust understanding of this and prepare for it, rather than sticking their heads in the sand of the cultural pablum about how the real threat is a rising theocracy or Christian fascism. Our society is turning up the heat, trying to smoke Christians out of the public square for good. Of course, the secular leftists are going to promise the frog that the water it's now boiling in has always been this hot, but neither the frog nor you should buy it. Consider the churches were forced to close with solid scientific evidence supporting the decision at the time for months in 2020, even as casinos and strip clubs were allowed to stay open. That was during COVID. We remember for years, private business owners have been dragged to court, targeted for destruction of the LGBTQ plus movement. The IRS has been caught targeting Christian nonprofits. How the Obama administration, Department of Health and Human Resource Services, relentlessly prosecuted Christian charity, Little Sisters and the Poor, over their religious beliefs against paying to provide for abortion. Against paying for abortion and contraceptives. It took almost a decade for the Little Sisters to finally prevail in the Supreme Court. There's others. There's Jack Phillips, who, think back, he was a baker who refused to bake a cake for a gay wedding. There was a florist who was eventually forced into retirement because she also refused to compromise on her traditional Christian faith commitments and participate in celebration of sin. In this case, it was a same-sex wedding. And then there was, remember, Coach Joe Kennedy was fired for his First Amendment right to pray to God in public. It took him almost 7 years to fight to undo this unjust persecution, prevailing only when the Supreme Court ruled that a government entity sought to punish an individual for brief, quiet, personal religious observance, fully protected by the free exercise and free speech clauses of the First Amendment. The Constitution neither mandates nor tolerates that kind of discrimination. Legally, we might call this discrimination, but make no mistake, it's also persecution. Persecution against Christians because of their faith in Jesus Christ as King and their refusal to compromise on basic teachings in the Bible. I've heard from Christians who know that they were unlikely to ever get promoted past a certain point for holding to their sexual ethics. Every June, hundreds and thousands of believers in corporate America face the persecution of being forced to fly the pride flag, or maybe get fired. What do you call it when a Christian is fired for believing that, according to God's word, God made men as men and women as women, and only those two genders? Or for refusing to tell lies by using she, her, they, them, he, him, this is the sort of thing that we all have. There's a possibility we're all exposed to and we're all faced with. Remember COVID? Did it shut down churches? Did it shut down churches in Kansas? In California, it shut down churches, and some of these churches who chose to stay open, I can't say it was a Seventh-day Adventist church. It wasn't. But chose to stay open, and so they would lock up the pastor, throw him in jail. And he sued. He sued the government, won in the Supreme Court, and the government was forced to pay that church damages, which I think the guy chose to give it all to the lawyer, which I think it was a religious freedom lawyer. How about the vaccination mandate? Did that affect any of you? It did me. I chose not to get the vaccination. It's my personal choice. I don't really care what anybody else's choice is, but I chose not to. It happened to be shortly after I was laid off at Merle's place, and so I was looking for work. And I was responding and headed for an interview. Actually, I had a phone interview. And one of the questions was, have you been vaccinated? And I said, no, I haven't. And they said, we're not interested. So that vaccination mandate did affect me personally. I'm sure we can all think of things that we've all been affected by. Okay, I'm going to close with what is religion, just so we don't have any misunderstandings what it is, and make sure that we're not following the wrong ideas. The First Amendment of the Constitution says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Now that's a mouthful, but I think we've all heard it enough to know the popular thing is a separation of church and state, which separation of church and state doesn't show up in the Constitution, but this is what it's referring to. Fast forward 250 years, and religious freedom is one of the most pressing issues in American culture today. Let's look at some of the concerns surrounding this debate. First of all, what is religious freedom? Religious freedom is more than to worship in a synagogue, church, or a mosque. It means people shouldn't have to go against their core values and beliefs in order to conform to culture or government. Religious freedom protects people to live, speak, and act according to their beliefs peacefully and publicly. It protects their ability to to be themselves at work, at class, and at social activities. Okay, that sounds good, but does such freedom allow people to do whatever they want under the cover of religion? No. The Supreme Court has said federal government may limit religious freedom, but only when it has a compelling interest to do so in order to protect the common good and limit people's ability to harm others. Here's how that applies to the most common allegations in religious freedom cases today. Charges of discrimination. Should florists, photographers, and bakers be forced to provide their services for same-sex weddings and celebrations that violate their religious beliefs? Let's flip the question. Should a lesbian graphic designer or printer be forced to create a flyer for a religious group's rally opposing same-sex marriage? In both cases, the answer is no. There are plenty of other bakers to provide cakes for same-sex weddings, and there are other graphic artists a religious group can hire. Additionally, in neither example is a person or group being denied a service because of who they are. It's because of the specific service they are requesting. In these cases, there is not a compelling interest for the government to interfere. That is very different from Jim Crow laws that mandated segregation based on racial supremacy. So let's talk briefly about Jim Crow laws. Excuse me. These laws prevented all individuals and businesses, regardless of their personal beliefs, from opening their doors and providing their services to African Americans. These laws enforced widespread discrimination and denied African Americans basic necessities. The government absolutely had a compelling interest to interfere. The next question is the important one. Does religious freedom mean special rights? No. Religious freedom prevents the cultural majority from using the power of the state to impose their beliefs on others. This protects everyone, religious and non-religious, alike, from the government becoming so powerful that it can tell people what to think and how to act. A government that intrudes on conscience will not hesitate to intrude on other freedoms. Additionally, forcing individuals and base faith organizations to choose between living out their religious beliefs or serving their neighbor actually harms our community. Did you know that an estimated 350,000 religious congregations operate schools, pregnancy centers, soup kitchens, drug addiction programs, homeless shelters, adoption agencies? These efforts serve 70 million Americans each year, and the value of their services are estimated over $1 trillion annually. Ultimately, everyone benefits from religious freedom. It covers all people equally: Christians, Jews, Muslims, agnostics, and atheists. Religious freedom preserves America's diversity, where people of different faiths, worldviews, and beliefs can peacefully live together without fear of punishment from the government. Efforts to repress religious freedom is not just an attack on individual liberties and human dignity, but on the very foundation that has made America strong. So with that, I'll leave it. Next week is Religious Liberty Sabbath. Not this week, next week. Bring your donations for the cause. I think the offering will be going to religious liberty services. So that's it.